Some of these statues were slave owners, and it was such a horrible thing to have slavery. So, my thing is, why? That's my question, why?
There are other ways Germans work to keep the lessons of history alive. The mantra of never again, of necessity a continuum, passed down from generation to generation.
Growing up in Germany, being faced with an uncomfortable past felt like the most normal thing in the world. Being constantly reminded of the Shoah, commonly known as the Holocaust, everywhere I went to was daily business. From first grade on, our fault in all of it and the responsibility we bear to never let it happen again was taught to us constantly. This is part of a practice called Erinnerungskultur, which translates to a culture of remembrance and has shaped the lives of most Germans, especially of those born after 1968. Around that time, our country decided that we could only move forward and change for the better if we acknowledge and publicly condemn the faults of our past. Memorials were built, museums created, school curricula adapted, and a Remembrance Day was implemented. I will argue that this culture has had the desired effect and that it has helped Germans to become more tolerant as a nation. The US, in comparison, has chosen to uphold a culture of denial. Historical education is most often inaccurate or incomplete. Memorials of war criminals and slave owners are still standing, and any uncomfortable part of history, be it of the state, a person, or a building, is swept under the rug. However, as James Baldwin said, the only way to get past it is to confess. Therefore, I argue that a cultural shift to a culture of remembrance, similar to the German Erinnerungskultur, would end the US's historic practice of denying its own past, and by that would move it towards an anti-racist future. The purpose of this research is to show that America can become anti-racist if the right steps are being taken. As mentioned, I experienced the effects of a culture of remembrance firsthand. But in order to scientifically discuss what big of an influence such a practice is, one needs to understand where it comes from and what it entails. The idea of establishing such a culture was first brought up by Theodor Adorno in 1966 when he gave a radio speech called Education After Auschwitz. He stated that this education has to happen in two areas of society: education in childhood, and as a general enlightenment for all of society that creates a climate that permits no repetition. Adorno felt the need to make such a public announcement because Germans, until then, thought of themselves merely as victims and avoided taking responsibility for their crimes. He was instrumental in creating the German Erinnerungskultur. His speech intensified discourse and triggered models to face history, which entail first teaching about National Socialism and the Shoah as an obligatory part of German school curricula, second, implementing an official Holocaust Memorial Day on January 27, and third, creating memorial sites to remember the victims and turning concentration camps, prisons, and other locations into museums, using federal funds and offering guided tours by survivors. While Germany's efforts to establish the Erinnerungskultur might be honorable, does it even have an effect on today's society? How is that part of history perceived today?
Nur weil es so lange her ist und jetzt keine persönliche Schuld mehr hat, glaube ich nicht, dass man jetzt einfach sagen kann, es war ja keiner.
70, 80 Jahre danach zu sagen, wir tragen daran Schuld, fände ich viel zu groß. Aber ich glaube, wir tragen eine Verantwortung, das was irgendwo verhindern, dass sowas wieder passiert.
Research done by Maitels et al. Suggests that education can make an important contribution to human rights awareness and foster appreciation of the harmful effects of stereotyping and scapegoating. Furthermore, according to J. Wab, more of those with perceived knowledge of the Holocaust attribute value to diversity. In summary, education about a dark past helps to prevent repetition and makes societies more aware and tolerant. When we compare Germany and the United States in their approaches to history, then, what is the US doing differently? Well, according to Eddie Glaude, the US is in complete denial of its dark history, which is precisely the reason why the country is not moving forward. In Our Racist Soul, he states, "I am convinced that if we are to imagine the country as a genuinely multiracial democracy, we have to tell ourselves a better story about who we are, how we ended up here, and why we keep returning to this hell." Currently, the US is more determined to preserve its shameful history than to own up to it.
Textbooks are written and edited for states.
This is Antoinette Waters, a history teacher at Wakefield High School in Arlington, Virginia, who says the state
Has the final say in what is in a textbook.
which is how you end up with textbooks like this 1993 textbook from Alabama, which opens its brief section on slavery with this: "People of all races have been slaves." and then goes on to teach children that the main difference between the North and the South leading up to the Civil War wasn't slavery, but rather a fight between the independent-minded Southern states and an overbearing federal government.
Furthermore, lawmakers are becoming bolder and more creative in their efforts at censorship, creating all manner of new rules about what can be taught in college classrooms, and taking measures to prevent states from removing memorials of historically very problematic individuals. This approach will set the US back even further when it comes to making society anti-racist and inclusive, because, as Baldwin said, if you can't confess, you can't be forgiven, and if you can't be forgiven, you can't get past it. However, there are organizations and individuals who take countermeasures to create a culture of remembrance in the US. Bryan Stevenson, the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, initiated the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, which honors the names of each of more than 4,000 African Americans lynched in the 12 states of the South from 1877 to 1950. He hopes that memorials such as the mentioned will bring awareness to society.
My hope is that people will leave this space prepared to say, never again can we tolerate racial bias and bigotry anywhere.
The Martin Luther King Memorial in Atlanta, Georgia, details the history of the civil rights movement and its general historical importance. There are no entrance fees, making it accessible for everyone. Furthermore, memorials like the 9/11 Memorial on Ground Zero in New York City are proof that the US has been able to establish a culture of remembrance that has had a palpable impact on society. The phrase "never forget" has gained a connotation that every US citizen is aware of. Why then shouldn't this country be able to implement an Erinnerungskultur with the same effects when it comes to commemorating other historical events, even if they might be uncomfortable? The effects of teaching children about historical racism are only positive ones. According to a study by Julian Hughes et al., European American children who learned about historical racism had more positive and less negative views of African Americans than did children who received similar lessons that did not include information about racism. Furthermore, it was found that European American and African American children who heard explicit information about racism expressed greater valuing of racial fairness than their peers who did not receive explicit lessons about racism. Therefore, educating US citizens about its dark history would only be beneficial for anti-racist societal development. Germany's approach is not perfect by any means, but Adorno's thoughts on a culture of remembrance helped to establish a historic awareness and a culture that centers around never again, which helped the younger generations to walk a more anti-racist and tolerant path. Racism still exists, of course, but is far more condemned by the general public, and there are laws in place that support victims of racism and anti-Semitism. While a lot of Americans like Bryan Stevenson try to establish an Erinnerungskultur, it needs to happen on a federal level for the effect to be palpable in the entirety of the US society. A first step needs to be to eradicate or adapt all monuments of anyone who was involved in the Confederacy, slavery, or the Civil War, and it has to be made clear that these parts of history are to be condemned and not repeated. If that happens, an anti-racist future is entirely possible. But the past needs to be dealt with in order to move forward.